Here on Segal Talks at the Martini Segal Theatre Center, the Graduate Center, CUNY, in the middle of Manhattan, Midtown, and it's another gray and rainy day here in New York, and our country still, is in uncertainty, even so it becomes clearer and clearer that, we are looking forward to a new political era, and with the presidential election, the COVID numbers are rising. It's alarming already. Starting today, all restaurants will have to close, I think, at 10 o'clock, and there is a possibility of another lockdown looming over us. For us, it has been a good week here at the Segal Talks. We have been investigating the field of the theater of the real, and it's day 3 of it, and we have with us the brilliant Carol Martin from NYU, the Tisch School of the Arts, who has coined, in a way, the term or cemented it in her research and in her books, which, I think a significant contribution to the field to establish this. Was this next perhaps to the site or on-site work, the most significant development in the last decades, next to the entry, I think, of the real, with the experts of the everyday, the participatory, socially engaged art. So theater real that also covers this is something we really have to think about, especially now when we think about theater performance and the political. And coming out of these talks, which we had with over 150 artists, it becomes clear that this form of theater across nations, across continents, is perhaps offering us better questions or better solutions for how to present meaningful artistic reflections on a stage. And with us today, we have Nick Kent from the great Tricycle Theatre in London. And Carol will give us an introduction a bit on the field of the theatre of the real, and then about Nick's work. And yesterday we had Rabbi Murray, which was a fantastic discussion also, which we had here. I think it's worth to go back to it, as well as to Hotel Modern from Rotterdam. And so today, Nick, welcome to join us. What time is it and where are you?
Thank you. It's 5 o'clock and I'm in the Cotswolds, about 80 miles from London. It's been a beautiful day, but we are locked down already. We've been locked down for about 10 days. And we all want to know, has he gone yet?
Well,
not yet.
Not yet. Oh dear.
It's his shadow. The shadow is still looming, and perhaps it will loom. Most people think he will reluctantly resign and step down, but announce his candidacy for 2024 at the same briefing. So we'll see. It's there was the season finale with the elections, but perhaps there will be another season, and it's not going to be over. Carol, tell us a little bit, about your work and your field, which you have examined so closely.
So first of all, thank you for that lovely introduction, Frank, and welcome, Nicolas Kent. So I'm going to say a few words about theater of the real, and then I'll introduce Nicolas more thoroughly. So what I'm proposing with the phrase theater of the real is that there have been a variety of methods. There's a lot of different kinds of nomenclature, from documentary theater to verbatim theater to reality-based theater, theater of fact, theater of witness, tribunal theater, nonfiction theater. There are even restored village performances, war and battle reenactments, autobiographical theater. There's a company in the UK called Reported Delivery. So it's a kind of a great growth of theater, all of which I see as related in that articulating a relationship to reality, to real events, with different kinds of methodologies and maybe different goals and aims. So yesterday we talked a little bit about a shift in a portion of the field from definitive representation of real events to representation that's more indeterminate, that doesn't complete the story that's told, that kind of questions its own sources and its ability to draw conclusions, that mixes fact and fiction. And I think that's particularly true for Rabie Mouet's work, but many others as well. What is predominantly done in the UK. So in the US, we've tended to call this form, and we tend to call it documentary theater. In the UK, they tend to call it, or they do call it, verbatim theater. It does something different than what I just described. Verbatim theater is created from transcripts of interviews with people who are connected to a common event or subject. The transcripts can also be the interviews conducted by the author. It can also use court records, including trial testimony. It's, some of the functions it enables are trial in the court of public opinion, or retrial of miscarriages of justice, enabling a diversity of class, race, and gender to be heard in the public forum of theater, and it is a public forum. Condensing and examining testimony in the form of a radical summary presented in the theater, over an hour and a half. So a little bit about Nicolas, again, welcome. So he was the artistic director of the Tricycle Theater from 1984 to 2012. In that role, he created programming for the immediate neighborhood, and I hope you talk to us a little bit about your innovations in producing. This was a working class neighborhood with many ethnic groups. He presented also plays from Ireland, and over a period of time, what he did there became known as the Tricycle Tribunal plays, many of which he directed. Nicolas has worked with many famous actors and won many awards, too many to name, including the Evening Standard Drama Awards for pioneering political theater, and the Oliver Special Award Achievement for the Great Game Afghanistan. So Nicolas's guiding idea, if I may say this, is his conviction that theater can be an instrument of change. And I want to give you a quote from Nicolas. At its best, it gives us the gift of celebrating each other's different cultures and beliefs, ages and sex. It teaches us new truths about life and questions old beliefs. And finally, it is a communal experience that through empathy between actors and audience binds us together by educating and entertaining us, both emotionally and intellectually. And that's it. That's perfect in a nutshell. There's too many works to mention, but I just want to name a few to give you some sense of the oeuvre of what Nicolas has either produced or written himself, and definitely directed. So The Color of Justice, 1999, was Richard Norton Taylor calls himself the editor of that work, using the transcripts of the Macpherson Inquiry. So this play and all of the events tell the story of the racist murder of the 18-year-old Stephen Lawrence by a group of white thugs in 1993. Repeated attempts to bring the murderers to justice failed. The British public became outraged at police incompetence and the failure of justice, both of which became kind of tabloid stories. So this was omnipresent, I think, in British consciousness. Finally, Home Secretary Jack Straw asked the respected Judge Sir William Macpherson to lead an inquiry into the case. The inquiry, which is a kind of examination of what happened or didn't happen during a number of trials or a trial, doesn't have legal consequences in the strict sense of being able to convict those who think should be convicted, but it did do a number of things. It confirmed Stephen's parents' allegations about police incompetence and mishandling evidence. and the likelihood of the guilt of the white youths. So there was no literal redress possible. It did roll out over the years, but there were some very important things that came out of the McPherson report. It demonstrated institutional racism in the investigation and prosecution of racially motivated crimes. McPherson also said that subconscious racism, as opposed to overt racism, played a part in the British legal system. And this was like a new category of consideration. The play still performed in schools and universities and was included on the reading list of police training colleges, both of which are extraordinary. And in terms of what I said about, radical condensation, radical summary of a whole years of events, that the transcripts for the inquiry numbered more than 11,000 pages, and Richard Norton Taylor honed this down to something that could be embraced in an evening of theater. There's also Guantanamo, Honor Bound to Defend Freedom by Victoria Brittain and Jillian Slovo, which looks at the detentions in Guantanamo Bay and asks how much damage is being done to Western democratic values in the war on terror. The Great Game Afghanistan by 13 playwrights, maybe I'll name them when we show that clip, explores the history, politics, and social life of Afghanistan and its relationship to the West. All the President's Men, more recently, written by Nicolas, about the US confirmation hearings of Trump's key political appointees. And this is just to name a few of so many. And America is still producing many things that British people can write plays about. So hang on there. I just want to say a few biographical things about Nicolas, which are extraordinary. His father was a German Jewish refugee who arrived in Britain in 1936. Who changed his name from Kahn, K-A-H-N, to Kent. His father married an English Christian woman. And part of Nicolas's experience growing up was an experience of questions. Was I Jewish? Was I Christian? Was I German? Was I British? And that this dual identity, as dual identity often does, helped him learn to deal with racism and develop a hatred of bullying and injustice. So welcome, Nicolas. We're so happy to have you with us. And would you say a few words more about your producing and how you came upon this idea of verbatim theater? I know it emerged across the UK, but your particular idea of it.
Well, thank you very much for such a kind introduction. It's very, very nice to be on this HowlRound webinar, I think they call it these days. Anyway, I suppose my awakening to the political power of theatre came through, I think, three seminal moments. One was seeing the Costa Gavras film, Zed, which was about the dictatorship of the colonels in Greece. And the second was came from America. Bentley's Are You Now or Have You Ever Been, which is trial transcripts of the McCarthy hearings, which was very extraordinary to see. And I realized what a power politically theatre could have. And thirdly, I think meeting Mustafa Matura in the very early 70s in Edinburgh when I was at the Travis Theatre, and his experiences of racism and just getting involved with the Black community at that beginning of my career. I didn't do that many new plays or new political work until I got to the Tricycle, which I came to the Tricycle through Mustafa because I did his rather wonderful play, Playboy of the West Indies, which I'd done at the Oxford Playhouse, and we transferred it to the Tricycle. And it was a big success there. And as a result of its success, I got invited to become artistic director of the Tricycle, which was a very high honor at the time. The theatre was in an area which was mainly Black and Afro-Caribbean, Black and Irish, and Catholic, obviously, with the Irish community. And they were experiencing two hot wars, basically, because we had Margaret Thatcher effectively supporting the apartheid government in South Africa. And also we had the war going on in Northern Ireland. And simultaneously, we had the Cold War. And so I started by doing a lot of Black work, much of which was brought in from South Africa, from the Market Theatre, and a lot of which was homegrown, and quite a little bit of which came from people like James Baldwin. We did Amen Corner, and Jimmy came over to see it, and we got to be friends. And other, Alice Childress, Lorraine Hansberry, a lot of Black American plays, and also an enormous amount of Irish plays. And then in the early 90s, those two hot wars got solved to some extent. We had the Good Friday Agreement in Ireland, and we had Mandela being released from jail, and the coming of the Rainbow Coalition, and Mandela becoming president of South Africa. And meanwhile, the Berlin Wall had collapsed. And there I was running a theatre in a multicultural area, working class area, as you've already said. 98 languages were spoken in this area. And suddenly, my political crusading had gone right down the drain, thankfully for some very good outcomes. And I thought, what am I going to do now? And I used to play tennis most Sundays with Richard Norton Taylor, who was the security editor of The Guardian. And we have this penchant in England of having public inquiries. When something goes wrong, the government throws up its hands in horror, says, we won't deal with this, but we'll set up an inquiry. We'll get an independent judge. He will report, and then we'll deal with it, which in many ways is quite a good way of doing it, but it's a very time-consuming way, and it makes things happen over quite long periods. And they also happen, well, they used to happen in camera, effectively. There was no TV in there. You read the reports over a number of years, Bloody Sunday over 6 years, the Lawrence Inquiry over 18 months, Half the Picture, which was the first one we did, over about a year. And at that time, journalists went to see it, they'd report the next day, and you couldn't get an overview. And Richard Norton Taylor, who I played tennis with, used to regale us every Sunday. There were 4 of us playing tennis, a film director, me and another director. And he used to regale us with what had happened at the hearings. Had Mrs. Thatcher come, had so-and-so come, and it was about the sales of arms to Iraq that the British government was colluding in during the Iran-Iraq war. And I said, after about 8 weeks of this, I said, well, why don't we do this as a play? And he said, well, I've never thought of it as a play. And I said, well, it would make a really good play. And I rang various people and said, what do you think? And everyone said it would be interesting. And then next Sunday, I read in the Sunday Times and also in the Observer, our 2 quality newspapers at the time, who said this will be the biggest constitutional inquiry and upset in the British Constitution since the war. And I thought, well, we should do it on stage. And we set about doing it. My box office people announced they were going to go on holiday, as 2 men and a dog would come and see this show. And we completely sold out. And the minute we announced it, it sold out. We took it to the House of Commons and played it there. and it was before the inquiry had reported. It got onto BBC television, and it got quite a huge audience. And since then, I decided at that time, 1993, the way forward was public inquiries and single issue politics where we could make a change.
Mhm. So how do you turn a journalist, Richard Norton Taylor, into a playwright? I mean, what was that process?
Well, he's a very talented journalist, and public inquiries have a beginning, a middle, and an end. And they are dramatic. There's always, it's a question and answer. It's a courtroom drama, effectively. We made ourselves some rules. We decided that whatever happened, we put both sides of the argument. We were lucky we put in between bits of fiction, which I got some writers, different writers, John McGrath, a very talented political writer, to write one or two cameos which went between various scenes, looking at from the point of view of someone, a Kurd who'd been killed at Halabja with the gas attacks by Saddam Hussein, and things, and an arms dealer who was selling arms to Saddam Hussein, a British arms dealer. But mainly we took just the structure of the inquiry. We obviously had some very key evidence from Margaret Thatcher, who insisted that she wasn't offending any laws, and the laws were only guidelines. And she kept on reiterating guidelines, and she almost became a comedy act for the inquiry. But it just was very powerful to see the way the government weaseled itself out of this inquiry, this inquiry effectively, when they'd obviously broken the law.
Mhm. So what is the theatrical representation of these events do that's different from following them in the news?
Well, it's very difficult to find a journalist like Richard who can condense something that's 9 months long and find the key moments out of it. So you get an overview, because no one follows an inquiry day after day after day, and they get very muddled about it and they miss a few days. Whereas this way, you get an overview. You get an hour and a half or 2 hours. You see the beginning, middle, and end of this inquiry and the key moments. And you get obsessed by the detail. You suddenly see the issues it raises, and you get a really good overview. Also, you're seeing it communally with 200, 300, 500 other people, and you're sharing those emotions, and you're laughing at some of the witnesses that they could possibly think they could get away with this. You're getting angry, and it's provoking you to think differently. With the Lawrence inquiry, people saw some of the evidence, and they were sitting on bench seats, Black people next to white people, and suddenly people began to empathize with the racism that Black parents were going through, worrying about their children going out at night, with the incompetence of the police. Institutional racism, for instance, was coined for the first time effectively in Britain by the Macpherson inquiry. And that inquiry was a hugely big moment for us. I mean, it was the biggest moment through to now, and Black Lives Matter and George Floyd, but which was obviously universal. But it was, the Rodney King murders in LA.
Yes.
The Stephen Lawrence was so big for us, and the family had campaigned. And I now still am in touch with Neville Lawrence, who a week ago, they're doing an inquiry at the moment. There is a public inquiry about the way the police are going undercover and infiltrating them and themselves anonymously into people's families. And that happened to the Lawrence family in 1993 after Stephen's death. And only now are the police being prosecuted for that.
Mhm.
It's incredible what this family have campaigned. But the play went out, we did it in theatre, we toured it, we took it to Northern Ireland. It made a huge difference to people. I mean, maybe, we'll hopefully see a clip of it in in a minute. It's quite hard hitting, especially when you see the thugs that actually killed Stephen.
And how do the sets tend to be realistic, more or less, or some version of realism? And how do the actors approach playing real people? Is their process the same? Are they different? Do they study them? Do they invent them according to what makes sense with the dialogue that they're given?
It's a very good question. I always ask them not to imitate, but to find the essence of the character, to read all the evidence so that the character might have been on the public stand for maybe in the witness box for 2-3 days. So I asked them to read every bit of the evidence, and we're only going to show 10 minutes of that evidence. And if possible, they go to meet the people and they try and get an essence of what and empathize with the character as much as possible. It was very interesting. There was a government minister when we did the half the picture, the Scott inquiry, called William Waldegrave. And he had sort of washed his hands of the whole thing and not really called anyone to account. And I'd never seen him giving evidence, and there was no recording of it. And a journalist and the actor hadn't seen him either, but had read it. And the actor sort of washed his hands of as he was saying things. He kept on doing this as if he was washing his hands. And a journalist came up to me who'd been there every day. And Richard hadn't been there, I think, on the days of Waldegrave. But another journalist saw our show and he came and said to me, "It's incredible. He caught every gesture. William Waldegrave was washing his hands all the way through his evidence."
Could you talk a little bit about All the President's Men, one of your more recent works, and then we'll show a short clip of it?
Well, I rang the wonderful Oscar Eustace, who I'm a terrific fan of, who actually, I think the first thing he ever directed was my play about Srebrenica, which I edited. And I rang him when Trump got elected. I believe he did get elected the first time around, didn't he? Anyway, I rang him then and said, "What about doing the Senate confirmation hearings?" And he said, "Well, that's an idea." And I said, "Surely it'll be very interesting because it will introduce us to the president's men. We don't know who he's going to choose, and we don't know how, who these people will be," because he was talking about draining the swamp and bringing in new people. So I then, Oscar said, "Yes, let's go with it." And I sat down and he gave us, he said, "I'll commission it, but I want to see the script first." So, and he said, "I will do it if the script's all right." And so I sat down and I did it on spec, really, we spent with a friend, Charlie Westenra, who was my assistant director on various plays, but she helped me edit and type up what we thought was useful. And we got the transcripts and we edited it down, and we made it into, it was a great richness of who to choose. And obviously we looked at Tillerson because it seemed important. Secretary of State would affect the world. We looked at the medical, I'm sorry, I've lost it for a second. The health secretary, because of Obamacare and whether that would be dismantled. We looked at Pruitt with the environmental care and whether that was going to stay the same, because we knew Trump's attitude to green issues. And finally, sorry, it's so long ago, I've forgotten for a second who we took the green issues Secretary of State. Oh, and obviously Sessions, because that was so important as to the Attorney General would have such power as to keep the president in power. And all the questions about Russian interference were going at that time. And it was before Sessions recused himself. And so I then sent it to Oscar. he thought about it for a bit, but I also sent it to the National Theatre, and the National said yes simultaneously with Oscar saying yes. And then I said, well, why don't you both get together and do it? So we did it in the West End at the Vaudeville Theatre for one night as a reading. And then we did it, and Oscar got me the starriest cast possible. And we did it in the town hall to a wonderful audience. There was a bit of a riot on before we started because there was a demonstration going on, and the police had to clear the, and Oscar came in very, very excited and said, I've never done a theatre which has caused a riot. I had to get through a police cordon to get in and see it. But it was an extraordinary evening. Should we show a bit of it?
Yes, yes. Andy, if we could see a bit of it, that would be great. This is All the President's Men with a question mark, right?
Yes, the question mark is important because we didn't know who they were.
All the President's Men, or yes. Yeah.
Senator Rubio.
Welcome, Mr. Tillerson. Do you believe during the 2016 presidential campaign, Russian intelligence services directed a campaign of active measures involving the hacking of emails and the dissemination of fake news with the goal of denigrating a presidential candidate and also undermining faith in our election process?
Senator, I've had no unclassified briefings because I've not received my clearance yet.
Mr. Tillerson, you've engaged in significant business activities in Russia. So I'm sure you're aware that very few things of a major proportion happen in that country without Vladimir Putin's permission. Is it possible for something like this to have happened without Vladimir Putin knowing about it and authorizing it?
I think that's a fair assumption.
Would you advise the president-elect to repeal the Obama administration's recent executive orders regarding cybersecurity and Russian interference in the 2016 elections?
I think the president-elect has indicated, and if confirmed, I would support the what's really required is a comprehensive assessment of our cyber threat and cybersecurity.
That is separate from the question of whether people that have already conducted attacks should be sanctioned and singled out. Do you believe that executive order should be repealed by the incoming president?
Well, if confirmed, Senator, I would want to examine it and all aspects of it.
Okay. Let me ask you this question. Is Vladimir Putin a war criminal?
I would not use that term.
Well, let me describe the situation in Aleppo, and perhaps that will help you reach that conclusion. In Aleppo, Mr. Putin has directed his military to conduct a devastating campaign. He's targeted schools, markets, and not just assisted the Syrians in doing it. His military has targeted schools and markets and other civilian infrastructure, resulted in the deaths of thousands of civilians. So, based on all this information and what's publicly in the record about Aleppo and the Russian military, you are still not prepared to say that Vladimir Putin and his military have violated the rules of war and have conducted war crimes in Aleppo?
Those are very, very serious charges to make, and I would want to have much more information before reaching a conclusion. I understand there is a body of record in the public domain. I'm sure there's a body of record in the classified domain. And I think in order to deal with a serious
what's happening in Aleppo,
like this,
it's in the public domain. Videos and the pictures are there.
I would want to be fully informed before advising the president.
Well, there's so much of it. There's so much information out there. It should not be hard to say that Vladimir Putin's military has conducted war crimes in Aleppo, because it is never acceptable for a military to specifically target civilians. I find it discouraging, your inability to cite that, which I think is globally accepted. I want to, in my last minute and a half here, move really quickly to an additional question. I want to enter in the record, Mr. Chairman, without objection.
Without objection.
A partial list of political dissidents, journalists, and critics of Vladimir Putin who were suspiciously murdered or died under highly suspicious circumstances. Mr. Tillerson, do you believe that Vladimir Putin and his cronies are responsible for ordering the murder of countless dissidents, journalists, and political opponents?
I do not have sufficient information to make that claim.
Are you aware that people who oppose Vladimir Putin wind up dead all over the world, poisoned, shot in the back of the head? And do you think that that was coincidental, or do you think that it is quite possible or likely, as I believe, that they were part of an effort to murder his political opponents?
Well, people who speak up for freedom in regimes that are oppressive are often at threat, and these things happen to them. In terms of assigning specific responsibilities, I would have to have more information. I look forward, if confirmed, to becoming fully informed. But I am not willing to make conclusions on what is only publicly available or had been publicly.
None of this is classified, Mr. Tillerson. These people are dead.
You're
Political opponents are dead.
Your question was about people who were directly responsible for that. I'm not disputing that these people are dead.
Thank you.
Okay. So, you know, this is a great example of letting the circumstances speak for themselves. But was the audience response with laughter surprising to you?
Very. I think, well, because it was very early days. This was in, Trump had been sworn in on the 20th of January, and that we were doing this in April. So I think people wanted to let off steam a little bit about, you know, obviously about the incompetence, but I think this was the first time people had really sat in a theater and seen what the way people answered these questions and how extraordinary these people were, that they were evading questions, and, you know, and Tillerson was being an ally of Trump in this appalling way. I'd come from Exxon, and he'd had no experience of statecraft, and I think, you know, this was his first outing, and I think people were fairly horrified. I think the laughter was horror. I mean, in London, when people saw it, which was before we did it in March in London, which was a month after these hearings. And I've talked to a couple of Americans afterwards, and they said it was horrific. They had no idea. These hearings were on C-SPAN, but no one was spending all day long watching them.
Right.
Except me, unfortunately. And the horror of it was unbelievable.
What was the demonstration outside that you said Oscar was so excited about when he came?
Well, there was a demonstration. They'd been moved down from Trump Tower. They were demonstrating against Trump at Trump Tower.
Oh, okay.
And they'd moved them down to 42nd Street. And then there were some pro-Trumpers too. So the police were trying to keep everyone apart. And they'd heard about the production, I think, and just decided they were going to protest. And decided they were going to support it. I mean, it was an extraordinary audience. We were packed, absolutely packed.
And what was your approach to directing this? I mean,
I had 3 days in London and did it quite carefully. Alec Baldwin flew in 3 hours before and just did it for me. We went through it once. Raoul, we went through more than once, and he looked at Rubio and studied it. But Alec, of course, had been playing Trump everywhere, so it was quite a difficulty for him. But the joy of doing these things is you don't have to learn them. You have to be very acquainted with the script, but you're allowed to do it from a reading effectively, because lawyers do it like that. They read the questions. And so, you know, to some extent, you don't want people to read the answers. But on the whole, you can get away with it. It's better if they can learn it. But obviously, Alec, I think, did magnificently. because he literally had 2 hours to do it.
So you're right in that lawyers do it effectively as a kind of staged reading. But
Yeah.
what do you think the relationship is between the theater and the law as public forums? I mean,
Well, I think it's somewhat similar. I mean, there's an awful lot of barristers. We have barristers and solicitors here. The barristers are the people who appear in court. And barristers love going to the theatre and love doing it. We used to do fundraisers at the Tricycle. We get barristers to do law plays like 12 Angry Men. And, you know, we had a list, we get them to do it in order for lawyers to come and see them and spend £200 a seat. And that would give us some money to do more work. So it was quite exciting from that point of view, but they all rather love doing it and they love being slightly showy. I'm doing something at the moment. I'm doing the Grenfell inquiry, which is about the Grenfell Tower that burnt down in 2017 with a loss of 72 lives. And there's a public inquiry about that. And the lawyer, there is one lawyer doing it, who is the QC to the inquiry. And other people there's so many interested parties, they're phoning in their questions to him in a break at the end of when he's examined a witness. But he's very quiet and doing it, he's very methodically. It's like watching a very methodical accountant. There is no showing off there at all. But occasionally he loses it for a moment. There's a wonderful moment on the 19th of October. You can see this online if you go to the Grenfell inquiry, where someone has hidden some diaries and not turned them over to the police. And you can hear the anger in the lawyer's voice. It's quite extraordinary. The morning session on October the 19th, if you go to the hearings of the Grenfell inquiry, it is so theatrical in an extraordinary way. So there are those moments. Obviously, you get lots of those moments in public inquiries.
Frank, I wanted to circle back to you. Do you have any questions, comments, observations? I think you have to turn your microphone on.
Yeah, I was instructed so we don't hear too many noises on this side. About the audience that comes and what is your experience of, in a way, at least people who come to the theater, participate in it, we kind of know on what side they are on. You know, they are most probably on the side who question Tillerson. And you represent a reality from C-SPAN, of course, you know, as a reenactment.
Yeah.
Instead of showing the C-SPAN again, and maybe with comments you put it into a context of a play, does it really reach out to audiences that are not already on a side before? Does that audience not reconfirm a reality we already see on the TV screens? So what is your hope in that sense? What does it do differently than the audience that watches it on C-SPAN?
Frank, I get this question a lot, and it's a very good question. It's people say, "Oh, your American expression is preaching to the choir." You are preaching to the choir to some extent, but there are a whole lot of people that come from different interest groups to see such a play. There are people who come for information. There are people who come because they're angry. There are people who come to laugh. These people come, and seeing it communally together in a large audience means that people either get strengthened in their convictions and they decide to go out and do something about it, or they get educated. In this case of Stephen Lawrence, a lot of people got educated. Some people had never sat next to a Black person going through a play as uncomfortable about racism. And they felt uncomfortable sitting next to a Black person who's receiving this play because they felt they had connived by being white and systemically supporting that racist view of the police, which they'd never questioned before. So there are all sorts of empathies that happen. And there are people who walk out in disgust and think it's wrong to look at these issues. But I think it's really important. I mean, if you show a bit of the Stephen Lawrence, you'll see how uncomfortable it is seeing that as an audience. And you can imagine we played to 50-50 audiences, I'd say, black and white audiences, and obviously Asian audiences as well. And it was really so interesting to see people talking to each other in the interval or at the end. And when we went to Stratford East to play it, we played to 80% black audiences there because of the locality. And people were just came out furious, but decided to act constructively furious.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think this is really a significant difference also in your theater to perhaps some other preaching to the choir type of verbatim or documentary plays, that you do make people uncomfortable and that you question also your own views. Rabbi Murray yesterday said, you know, if I do these plays, my work, I question myself, my own belief. Even I don't want to be confirmed into what I think, but to really engage with the subject. And I think this is a chance that lies in there. If it is done really, Michael Frayn once said, who came to the Segal talk, a play is really good if every character is strong. You know, every character
is absolutely
is right.
But
And
the other thing is, you know, you can get onto issues with these inquiry plays, which seem like side issues, but they're not. For instance, with the Grenfell, we are not tackling very much part one of the inquiry, which was about the actual fire and the response of the residents. We're looking at part two of the inquiry, which is about the people who constructed this building and the way they went about it. And there are literally 2,000 buildings in Britain affecting up to 3 million people that have this cladding on them. And so and they can't sell their houses or insure their houses or their flats because they're unsafe. And the government is doing nothing to remove that cladding. So there's a whole corporate manslaughter charges about to happen because the police are investigating simultaneously. B, the regulations aren't tough enough and someone needs to show this more. C, the inquiry has now been going on since 2017 and we're 2020, and it won't end till 22. And we could do this, we've got enough material now to do it on stage before the government brings through a regulation, a number of bills about the regulation of fire materials on buildings. So it may influence things, and that's why it's worthwhile. And there will be a large audience for this show when we do it.
Mm-hmm. Should we look at a very short clip of The Color of Justice? I want to forewarn our viewers and listeners that this has disturbing language referring to both race, predominantly race, but also gender. And Nicolas, maybe we want to characterize the particular moment in the inquiry. This is one of the young white thugs whose specific name I don't recall, who's on the stand.
Yeah, he's the ringleader of the racist thugs. Mm-hmm. And one thing that did come out of the inquiry is the law of double jeopardy got changed. So you could if you got new evidence, you could put people back on trial. And it's Jamie Accourt. I think he did go to jail for a very short time, but he's never really been served his time properly for this. And and you can see his attitude. It came at the end of the play and it shocked people to an extent. I mean, it was horrendous to watch this. It's not a pleasant scene. It lasts about 2.5 minutes, I'm afraid.
So Andy, could we see The Color of Justice?
Them Before anyone else asks you questions, I want to ask you one or two. You said that you were willing to help insofar as you can by speaking the truth.
Yeah.
As to the racism attitudes of yourself, and particularly your brother and the others, having seen the surveillance video, you must know that they showed the most terrible racism. Do you not know that?
I cannot speak on behalf of other people.
No. You have seen the film?
Yeah, I've seen it once, and it was a long time ago.
The only warning I will therefore give you is this. You have immunity in connection with the matters which have been investigated in the past. But if you commit perjury, you may be prosecuted. Do you realize that?
I understand that. I understand that.
Yes, Mr. Mansfield.
3rd of December, 1994, you're in custody, you're not there. It's 11:30 at night. I'm going to ask you about a specific passage near the beginning of the transcript of the video. By a strange, ironic coincidence, football is the topic of the day. Luke Knight complaining about the commentators wanting the Cameroons, fucking niggers, to win. Your brother says, makes you sick, doesn't it? Neil Acorte says, whilst picking up a knife from a window ledge in the room and sticking it into the arm of a chair, says, you rubber-lipped cunt. I reckon that every nigger should be chopped up, mate, and they should be left with nothing but fucking stumps. Now, Jamie, you forgotten that?
Yes, I have, yeah.
Well, now that I've reminded you of that, and there's plenty more in that vein, shocked, are you? Honest reply, please.
I ain't shocked. It's nothing to do with me, is it? I ain't shocked.
David Norris is saying, I go down Catford and places like that, I'm telling you now, with 2 submachine guns, and I'm telling you, I take one of them, skin the black cunt alive, torture him, set him alight. Then a little further down. I would blow their 2 legs and arms off and say, go on, you can swim home now. And he laughs. Neil Acorte, your brother, says, just let them squirm like a tit in a barrel. Do you find all this shocking?
I have no comment on it.
They were, this evidence, I mean, he denied he was a racist and he wasn't actually in the flat when they got the surveillance video, but he was so untruthful. And this helped, generally prove that obviously he was completely racist, but it was an uphill struggle because the police didn't have any evidence and didn't investigate. They lost evidence. Stuff was disposed of. It was dreadful, chilling.
It also put the consciousness of the British public on trial, so to speak. In other words, and helped with this devastating testimony. What became clear in the inquiry play and over the course of events is that Stephen Lawrence was an ideal citizen. He was good at school. He was a member of an athletic league. He was out with his friend going home. He was and opposed to that, the white kids were dropouts, and actually in the case of the Accords, the sons of criminals. And it really shifted the British public's view about race and about class in dramatic ways. And I think a lot of it was really, built around this horrible testimony of the Accord, the one we just saw, but also playing out in this short clip is something that you may not be able to recognize so clearly if you're not British. There are a bunch of different class accents interacting with one another. So could you speak to all of that a little bit?
Well, it's quite interesting. The lawyer you saw who questions him is, I would say, is, you know, upper middle class, well-educated lawyer, but he has done the most incredible work. He was in the Bloody Sunday inquiry. He has been there was a whole football inquiry where a lot of people were killed in a riot, and he headed up that inquiry. And he's working on the Grenfell inquiry now. So that you come across the same people again and again and again, because there are people that know how to do public inquiries, and they are the people that are representing the victims always. And what's also interesting is the judges start off by being, I think everyone thought Macpherson in the Lawrence inquiry was going to be fairly racist, because he was upper class Scotsman who really had no experience of street life or anything like that. And he slowly got turned. It took a long time, but he did actually become quite strident at the end, and the recommendations he made were quite strong. It was helped by the Bishop of York, who he had two assessors, the Bishop of York, who was black, and Sentamu, who's a wonderful man, and he sat with Macpherson. And also there was simultaneously there was also a very left-wing campaigner in London who was a Labour councillor and a doctor. I think he was a member of the Labour Party, and he was a Jewish doctor, and he'd exposed a lot of corruption. And the two of them worked on Macpherson too. So I think he became a bit of a hero, but he changed from this very Scottish laird, as we say, to someone who actually did allow the phrase institutional racism and called the Metropolitan Police institutional racist. And it was thought he would never do that. So it was there was quite a movement. And the recommendations of that panel have had a huge effect on British life. I mean, as has George Floyd and the BLM movement, big effect here. We haven't had the riots here at all. There have been some confrontations with the racist groups, but it has really meant there's been a movement, I think, not far enough, but there's movement certainly in the theatre and a lot of British institutions. I talked to a law firm the other day, and he said, "Oh, we've woken up. We're now starting to recruit a hell of a lot of BA, ME students, which is great, and they should be. There's a lot of ground to make up."
Great. Frank, did you have some observations?
Well, maybe I think we go to the big game, the Afghanistan play, from the kind of local stabbing, in the community, people you also then went to that large scale macrocosmos, should the Western world getting involved in Afghanistan? Does it make sense? Is it the right thing to do? And I would like to know, how did you collaborate as a collaborative producing model? With what ideas did you go in, and what did you learn? What did you come out?
I learned a lot. The British soldiers were dying in Helmand all the time. And when they were sent in big numbers, the minister for the defense minister said he didn't expect anyone to be killed, and the amount of people being killed was just enormous. I mean, and so I thought no one quite understood why we were in Afghanistan, or what was the political motivation for this. And I thought it was important to try and understand the imperialism that had happened to Afghanistan in 170 years since the British was first Anglo-Afghan War in 1842, and to look at the history of that all the way through. And so I got hold of I've read a number of books and found the key moments, I thought, in Afghan history. And I went out to a whole lot of really terrific authors like David Gregg and Simon Stevens and David Edgar and Lee Blessing and all sorts of people, Abby Morgan, and went to each of them, Ron Hutchison, and said, would you write a play about this specific period? And I gave them dates. I said, I want you to do it between 1842 and 1860. And I found that there were important things within those dates. And some of them, first attempt, Ron Hutchison rang me up from the States and said, well, of course, Sherlock Holmes died in Afghanistan, and Watson went out there and fought. No, what Watson went out. And I said, I don't think we'll be doing that. I want fact, not fiction. And so everyone, they were given half an hour each, and they were all invited to contribute in their time slot of maybe 30 years, maybe from 1950 to 1980. The key moments. And I sort of mapped out the key moments. I then went to Afghanistan myself in 2009 and spent 2 weeks talking to people there. I talked to journalists, and then I realized I would like to use some verbatim stuff in between. So I talked to a lot of people to give me verbatim material that we could do as we moved from one play to another. And so I combined verbatim with telling this story all the way through. And we played it in London. The head of the chief of the defense staff came to see it, insisted we did a performance for the army, which we did, a special performance. He said, you've got to take this to the States. We took it to the States. We played Washington, we played Minneapolis, and we played
New York.
New York. Yeah, New York, Minneapolis, Washington, and New York. And we, when on the last performance in Washington, somehow the Pentagon had never got there. And one big 4-star general who then was told to go there, I think by Petraeus, and also by Christina Lamb, who's a wonderful foreign correspondent, was correspondent for the Sunday Times, and knew him. And he came and he said, you have to do this for the Pentagon. And I said, well, we're in Washington now, we're about to leave. And he said, no, bring it back for the Pentagon. It's really important. And about 8 weeks later, I flew back to Washington, had dinner with him, and he said, I'm going to get you into the Pentagon to meet the head of public affairs. We've got to have this here. And he arranged that we played the Shakespeare again. We did it. We flew over again. It cost $250,000, which we got some money from some American veteran funds. And we played 2 performances for the Pentagon at the Shakespeare Theatre. They wanted us to play it in the Pentagon, but it took me 2 hours to get through security. Getting some of my cast who were Iraqi with rifles and weapons and explosions into the Pentagon would have taken 20 days. But we played it for 2 performances at the Pentagon, and they spent 9 hours with us on 2 days, and US Aid came as well. And we had amazing feedback from people, and it did change people's views. I talked to 6 army captains who'd heard about it and all been bereaved. Sorry, not been bereaved, all came back and divorced their wives and when they got back. And there was a play about healing and wives not understanding at the very end by Simon Stevens. And they came up to me afterwards and they said, that's our story. We're so pleased to see this. It really made a difference to us. So it was educational for people, I think. And it was very exciting to do. And it was a combination of verbatim with fiction, which I then later did with the bomb, the history of the nuclear bomb, with a number of plays doing it that way. Half-hour plays about Korea, about how India got the bomb, looking at different issues. So, that's one way we moved. And another way, there have been 3 ways I've done this. One is transcripts of trials, be it the International Criminal Court in The Hague, where I did Srebrenica, or the confirmation hearings or the Stephen Lawrence. And then we've made our own inquiries, which I've done with Gillian Slovo rather than Richard Norton Taylor, where we've actually set up, like Guantanamo, where we set up interviews with people about specific issues. And we did one for the National Theatre, Gillian and I, which was about, called Another World, which was about the mothers losing their sons to Islamic State, or daughters to Islamic State, and how the whole prevention thing was happening. So we set up, so there's sort of three ways I'm using the, as Carol would say, the truth, and verbatim theatre or political theatre in that way.
I think, Andy, could we go to the clip of The Great Game Afghanistan, please?
There you are, Sir Mortimer. There is your map. Take good care of it. The lines on it may be imaginary, but the problems they cause only too real. You'll be fighting because of them for many years.
It is our job to fight cheap wars so that our people back home can live expensive lives. There was a mistake. It has been an expensive war.
There's a village northeast of Gereshk called Mazdurak. It's deserted as far as we know. It's now considered a possible insurgent base.
They're closing in, aren't they?
Seems it.
Well, many innocent lives have been and will be lost in this war, but I truly believe it should not stop you from sending your daughter to school.
We Afghans always make the same mistake.
Shit! Jesus! Christ! Jesus!
What? You've never been under fire before, have you?
No.
I left out the wonderful Berkeley Rep, which of course we played too, and they were very much behind the project. Those were plays by Simon Stevens, the late Stephen Jeffries, Abby Morgan, and David Gregg, in that order. And they were all brilliantly.
There were 13 playwrights involved in composing this epic story of the Great Game of Afghanistan. I did see it here in New York at Skirball, and I had read a long article in the New Yorker, and I thought that the events that you chose were spot on in terms of really capturing the key moments of this particular history. You know, as you were speaking before, I was thinking in regards to an earlier question, what does this do? And it certainly does a number of different things, and different plays have different outcomes in terms of how they change our consciousness or reform thinking about the public forum. But one of the things they do as theater is that they kind of pause the flow of information that's all around us all the time. And in order to take time to absorb, to consider, to recognize, and to witness with others in a collective situation, which underscores the witnessing, the kind of determining events of our lives in terms of justice, lack of justice, in all different areas of life. And, you know, maybe that's one of the functions of theater, is that collective taking account and recognizing this has happened in this way, and not letting it flow by in this endless stream of information and experience that we're in today. But it creates this huge pause for everyone in ways that enable us to think differently.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I think what is so extraordinary about it is if you also look a bit at the history of theater, the engagement with the real, the realistic first steps by an Ibsen, where he said, let's put the family living room in Norway on a stage, or Gerhard Hauptmann, a German writer who produced the play The Weavers, where he showed the living conditions of Silesian weavers, and it was also played Parliament and changed the law. But then Brecht, who in a way who comes and said, it's no longer enough that we show, it has to be, should we show the world, it has to be a call to action. We have to go out, when we have to do something, we have to engage with it. And I think the additional thing also what you bring is that you also show a model, in a way, or you show a way to think about it in the way you produce it in a collaborative way. You also show a different approach that says there are different ways to understand the reality and come out of it with something that is changing us, but also the world, but still keeping all these ideas of the history of theater in it. I think it's remarkable, especially because the new inventions, what you have, the collaging, the idea of the verbatim plus the history plays, or the trials, which has been used, for centuries, but also, with taken from a newscast, images. So the idea of the collaging, the putting it together, and no longer, having the single point of view of a play. We talked earlier about where living normally, the soldier comes back from Afghanistan, the young son, and he talks with his mom and dad while they eat dinner. Often these are the plays that deal with this. Your approach is so different, and it's working, but it's also a colossal, it's a Olympian, Herculean effort, so it's just a stunning way how you use theater.
Well, I've been very, very lucky to have had wonderful collaborators. I had an administrator for my whole time at the Tricycle who used to always say, why are we doing that? That's not very interesting. Let's be more exciting than that, which normally you have the opposite. It costs too much. But when I said, and the board, when I said we're going to do something about Afghanistan, she said, great, let's do it. A woman called Mary Lauder, who's extraordinary. I had a secretary, Trish McElhill, who everyone rallied round and really helped. And I was helped very much by Jack Bradley, who used to be the literary director of the National Theatre, who started helping me put these plays together. When I had the idea of doing it, he would always say, you should use so-and-so player, you should get so-and-so, and he would help me script edit. And obviously the collaborators like Richard Norton-Taylor and Gillian Slovo, who I can't thank enough. So it's been a very good journey, I think, to do that. You wanted me just quickly to talk about, we did do some entertaining and fun things too. We, as a producer, I wasn't always that serious. We did Stones in His Pockets, which I brought in from Ireland. And we did 39 Steps, which the wonderful Mariah Aitken directed, both in London and in the States.
And rescued it from certain death, right?
He did, because they was going to die, and I then saw it in Oxford and said, come on, this is good enough, we must take it to London. And they said, no, we're terminating the tour here. You saw it on the only good night. And I said, we can make this work. And we did, we changed it a bit and made it work. It was written by Patrick Barlow, who of course I knew because the National Theatre of Brent, which had always played Brent, our theatre was in Brent. And so Small Island, it's what I've enjoyed always is bring over the market theatre. I think when you run a theatre, you've got to be open to giving other people a chance. It's part of the fun of running something. And I miss that, but it's terrific fun to bring in entertaining, fun things. And people say, why are you doing that? And I say, well, cheer everyone up, that's enough.
Absolutely, absolutely. Well, I think we've come to the end of our hour, which has been extraordinary, an hour and 15 minutes. It's so good to spend this time with you. And thank you, Frank, for inviting me to co-host and invite these incredible people from around the world to talk about their work, all of which is very illuminating. I did put your web page in the chat in case anyone would like to go to your web page, and there are short videos on the page as well that people can look at. Yeah.
Yeah, can I thank you to both of you? Thank you for being so wonderful. And Frank, thank you so much. I mean, what you're doing is extraordinary, because I watched the interview with Faye the other day from Hong Kong, which was extraordinary. And I mean, he's doing great work, I have to say. And it's a very tough environment. And he's an extraordinary man.
So maybe as a finishing question, what do you say to young theater artists now, young directors, in the time of Corona, but also, you know, what should they engage in? What did you learn where you say this worked? What is your advice of your decade-long work and engagement with theater?
Oh, I don't know. That's such a difficult question at the moment because everything's stopped. I think don't be too impatient and use this time to read and to see what other people are doing. And I just think I know it sounds silly, but I think it's really important, and directors don't do enough, to go to art galleries, to watch films and to read. The other arts, I think people get a bit blinkered, and it's, you know, you've got to go right across the board. I'm very struck that there's a wonderful essay by a judge in New Yorker who is at the criminal court in The Hague, who used to go and look at Vermeer every single day, because that is lunch hour, because that got him through doing the trials and the unspeakable crimes people did. And at the moment it is so difficult. And I think you've got to find a form of art, be it music, be it some form of art that you can get inspiration from and you can watch. I mean, I'm watching the Berliner Philharmonica, and it's just wonderful to see how that orchestra plays together. And you learn from that, and you learn how conductors make work. I think it's a question of immersing yourself as much as possible in other art forms, not just theatre. Well, theatre is impossible at the moment, sadly.
Wow, no, thank you. That's significant advice. And thank you for spending time with us and sharing. I'm sure you have talked so often about it, but for us, this is important to hear.
It's a terrific pleasure, and thank you for giving me the
opportunity. Carol, you know, this week was extraordinary, and your contribution to select the participants and to prepare. And I think it's also something that is changing our talks. And as a co-host, and we will be back with another week. Maybe also we should have one session just with Carol, and also about the idea of the field. I want to get deeper into it. Next week, we focus on dramaturgy, which will also be a first week of 2 or 3. And we start with my colleague Peter Ackersall, Peter from Australia, who is a dramaturg himself, a professor of theater, and also a leader in the field, and also in the field about thinking for dramaturgy, a meta-dramaturg, a dramaturg's dramaturg, I will say. And then we have Anne Cattaneo, who is the dramaturg of Lincoln Center Theatre with Sydney Mahone. She will talk about her work and her initiative. She's putting together a Wikipedia page on everything available, especially American dramaturgy, but resources she feels we all need to know and recognize, especially in America. It's not such big news for European theater. And then Sebastian Kaiser, who was Frank Castrov's dramaturg and still works at the Volksbühne in Berlin, and his engagement, the political engagement that he had in the extraordinary years of Volksbühne Berlin through Schlingensief and Kastorf and the Norwegian duo at Wege Wingard and Inga Müller. So this will be also an important a week, but this week was really extraordinary, and thank you, Nick, really for sharing your life and work in such a graceful way. We admire you. You are a model we look up to. Carol, something for you to say at the And they went so fast, these 3 days, yeah.
Yeah, they've gone very, very fast. And all the artists have been very different. And I really wanted to have Nick close out this week because his role as a director and as a playwright and as a kind of visionary artistic director, really revising what a theater could do. And we would call it regional theater. Not, I don't know what you call it. It's not off Broadway, but an off theater in London, how it can build its audience directly from the neighborhood, which is so important, and creative in terms of how people have to understand the theatrical enterprise as not being just for a certain stratum of the population, so to speak, but also the great political theater, and that it's not agitprop, but it's theater that makes us think, that makes us understand, and that makes us see differently. And those are all the things that theater can do so well. But with the tribunal plays and the inquiry plays and your newer work, that you're really helping people pause and consider events that have enormous consequences for their local communities, national and international. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thanks to HowlRound for hosting us, Thea and VJ.
Great.
I hope you will have a good dinner in London and maybe watching The Crown, the new season, or whatever you might be doing. Carol, again, thank you. Thank you to our viewers. I know we are asking a lot to take time out of your life. So much is out there already, but I do think it is important to listen to artists, great theater artists who have changed the field, expanded the field, who explored what they have to say might really also affect us, our life, and we live our lives also in the way they create their life and work. I think we can learn a lot from them. So thank you all, and stay safe. Stay tuned, and I hope we will reconnect next week. Thank you all. Bye.
It's a great honor to be part of this. Thank you very much, Frank, and thank you for what you're doing, and thank you, Carol, for hosting it so graciously. Thank you.
Bye-bye.